Humans pride themselves on their independence of thought and ability to reason, choose, and form their beliefs. We are taught from childhood that we control our mind's decisions and perceptions of reality, but nothing could be further from the truth. From the moment we wake up, our thoughts are not our own. Every headline we read, every advertisement we see, and every conversation we engage in is part of a vast, carefully orchestrated structure designed not to inform us but to shape us. Governments do not simply rule, they manufacture obedience. Corporations do not simply sell, they engineer desire. Media does not simply report, it frames reality itself. And yet, we go about our days completely unaware of how much of our thinking is not thinking at all but conditioned response. This is not merely manipulation in the conventional sense, it is an architecture of control so refined and deeply embedded in society's fabric that it no longer needs to be enforced. It is accepted, internalized, and repeated by you, me, and everyone else. But to understand how this system works, we must dissect its methods, the ancient strategies of control, the invisible mechanisms that shape our every thought, and the terrifying reality that the moment you believe you are immune, you are already. Niccolo Machiavelli, one of history's most notorious political strategists, understood something fundamental about human nature. Men are so simple, and so much creatures of habit, that he who seeks to deceive will always find someone who will allow himself to be deceived, the prince. People do not demand the truth. They require the comfort of believing they are in control. The most powerful trick is not dictatorship, but the illusion of choice. We are given elections where unseen hands have already selected the candidates. We are given products designed not to serve us but to make us perpetually unsatisfied. We are given news, not objective facts, but carefully curated narratives that ensure we think in pre-approved ways. Jean Baudrillard, one of the most radical philosophers of the modern era, understood this well. He argued, "We live in a world where there is more and more information and less meaning, simulacra and simulation. What appears as freedom is nothing more than a simulation of choice. Superficial disagreements captivate the masses, while the power structures remain unchanged. They are confronted with left versus right, this brand versus that brand, and these headlines versus those. However, regardless of their choices, the system continues to prevail." Plato knew this deception over 2,000 years ago. In his famous allegory of the cave, he described prisoners, bound from birth, seeing only shadows cast on a wall. To them, the shadows were reality. They never questioned that unseen forces were dictating the truth. How could they see anything but the shadows if they were never allowed to move their heads, the Republic? These shadows take a new form today: political spectacles, consumer trends, and manufactured outrage. Arthur Schopenhauer, known for his radical pessimism philosophy, exposed this phenomenon in human decision-making. He argued that free will is essentially an illusion and that the desires we believe to be our own are often externally imposed. A man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills, on the freedom of the will. Schopenhauer reveals that our desires are not freely chosen but conditioned by forces outside our awareness of truth, exploited by those in power. The individual unknowingly walks the path for them, convinced of their autonomy. Friedrich Nietzsche, ever the challenger of societal illusions, went even further. He believed that most people never honestly think for themselves, they merely inherit the thoughts of those who shape their reality. The individual has always had to struggle to keep from being overwhelmed by the tribe. If you try it, you will be lonely often and sometimes frightened. But no price is too high to pay for owning yourself. According to Nietzsche, the greatest danger is not external oppression but the internalized acceptance of predetermined thoughts. The individual does not challenge the system because the system makes them believe they are already free. Convictions are more dangerous enemies of truth than lies, human, all too human. In other words, the illusion of knowledge and self-determination is the very mechanism that ensures obedience. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel saw the struggle for power as an eternal cycle between the master and the slave. The slave does not simply obey because he is forced to. He obeys because he has been made to believe that obedience is natural. Phenomenology of spirit. Hegel revealed that physical force is no longer necessary once obedience becomes internalized. Modern control does not operate through tyranny or open oppression. It operates through voluntary submission to predefined choices. People embrace their servitude because they are conditioned to view it as freedom. They are given choices, but only within a system that determines their permissible range of thought. In 1967, French philosopher Guy Debord saw where modern society was headed. He described a world in which absolute power was not wielded through oppression, but through entertainment and distraction. The spectacle is not a collection of images, it is a social relation among people, mediated by images, society of the spectacle. In other words, the modern world does not need to hide the truth. It only needs to flood reality with distractions. While we argue over celebrities, scandals, and social trends, the fundamental mechanisms of power remain untouched. Debord's insight is chillingly relevant today. The more entertained we are, the less we notice what truly matters. Thomas Hobbes, one of the most influential political philosophers of the modern era, understood something chilling about human nature. During the time men live without a common power to keep them all in awe, they are in that condition which is called war, Leviathan. Hobbes argued that fear is the foundation of power. People do not naturally submit to authority, they submit because they are afraid. And the more frightened a population becomes, the more powerful its rulers grow. Make people believe they're in danger. Convince them that only one authority can save them. Watch as they give up their rights willingly, all in the name of safety. This is not just political theory. It is the mechanism that has shaped history, controlled empires, and still governs the modern world. Hannah Arendt, one of the most brilliant minds to analyze totalitarian regimes, saw the dangers of fear-driven obedience firsthand. She observed that fear does not merely suppress resistance, but erases the capacity for critical thought. Terror is not used to frighten people, but to force them into organized obedience. The origins of totalitarianism. Governments and institutions do not simply create fear to control individuals. They create fear to engineer mass compliance. When fear becomes dominant, people do not think, they react. A crisis erupts. A terrorist attack. A financial collapse. A pandemic. Immediately, new laws, restrictions, and surveillance programs are introduced. The public accepts them because they are afraid. And yet, when the crisis fades, the restrictions remain. The most radical revolutionary will become a conservative the day after the revolution, on revolution. People demand security, but once they have handed over their rights, they rarely get them back. While Hobbes and Arendt exposed how external power uses fear, Michel Foucault went one step further. He argued that the most effective control does not require force because people internalize fear. Surveillance is permanent in its effects, even if it is discontinuous in its action. Discipline, punish. Historically, kings and dictators needed physical oppression to maintain their rule. But in the modern world, power has evolved. You don't need secret police if people already police themselves. You don't need to silence dissent if people are too afraid to speak. You don't need a dictator if people willingly submit to authority. Foucault's idea of the Panopticon, a prison where inmates never know when they are being watched, describes how fear works today. Every move is tracked, every thought is monitored, and every opinion is recorded. People no longer need to be told what not to say, they self-censor before speaking. This is not tyranny through force. This is tyranny through psychological conditioning. A real subjection is born mechanically from a fictitious relation. Discipline, punish. The illusion of constant surveillance turns society into its enforcer. Fear does not just convince people, it transforms them. Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, argued that fear is the most profound and primal emotion, overriding reason, morality, and logic. The voice of the intellect is soft, but it does not rest until it has gained a hearing, the future of an illusion. But when fear is present, logic is silenced. Morality is ignored. People cling to authority like children to a parent. Freud saw that fear regresses people into an infantile state where they no longer think for themselves. Most people do not want freedom because freedom involves responsibility, and most are frightened of responsibility. And this is why fear works. It does not just make people compliant. It makes them desperate for someone else to take control. Soren Kierkegaard, one of the earliest existentialists, believed that true individuality is almost impossible in a world dominated by public opinion. People demand freedom of speech as a compensation for the freedom of thought which they seldom use. Either or. The modern world gives you the illusion of freedom. You can say whatever you want, right? But what happens when you say something that goes against the majority? You are ridiculed. You are shamed. You are silenced not by law, but by the overwhelming pressure to conform. So most people stop thinking for themselves and adopt safe opinions that will not get them ostracized. Kierkegaard saw this as a spiritual and intellectual crisis. He warned that people cease to be individuals when they fear standing alone. The crowd is untruth. The masses do not think. They react. They follow. They believe whatever makes them feel accepted. And those in power, they understand this better than anyone. The great political thinker Alexis de Tocqueville warned that society had found a more effective form of tyranny than dictatorship. The majority lives in the perpetual utterance of self-applause. Democracy in America. In the past, oppression was brutal. Governments silenced dissent with force. But today, society does it for them. No need for censorship when people fear questioning the norm. No need for tyranny when people submit willingly. Tocqueville predicted that modern democracies would not suppress speech through laws but through shame. The result? People live in mental cages, too afraid to challenge the world around them. John Stuart Mill, one of the greatest defenders of individual liberty, saw this coming. He believed the greatest threat to freedom is not government oppression but social pressure. The tyranny of the majority is more formidable than many kinds of political oppression on liberty. Governments may control laws, but society controls thoughts. And when the majority believes something, even if it's false, it becomes nearly impossible to resist. The worth of a state, in the long run, is the worth of the individuals composing it, on liberty. What happens when individuals stop thinking for themselves? Progress stops. Truth is replaced by popular opinion. The world descends into intellectual stagnation. And worst of all, the people don't even realize it's happening. The power to resist starts now. Now that you see how control works, you cannot unsee it. Every day, the system will try to pull you back into the illusion of choice, the paralysis of fear, and the pressure to conform. But you now have a weapon, awareness. You do not have to accept the choices given to you. You do not have to surrender your freedom out of fear. You do not have to conform to a system designed to control you. And the greatest act of resistance, thinking for yourself. Because the moment you do, you are no longer their pawn.